I mentioned that in 1884, he'd recorded every plant in Rooks County. And on July 16th of 1885, a botanist from the Kansas State Agricultural College came out to visit him. Elam was in the field cultivating corn. And the guy came out and they talked about plants and weeds. And eventually, the gentleman's name was Dr. Kellerman. And Kellerman reached down and picked a pigweed. And he showed it to Elam. And he said, you know, we have a lot of people in the university studying weeds. And he pointed to a little fungus on that weed. He said, what we need is somebody to study fungus. Well, that was a life-changing day for Elam. He became the studier of fungus, if you will. His first published work was Plant Rusts in Kansas. And in the next couple of years, he sent a lot of samples of plant rust to the Kansas State Agricultural College. Several of these were brand new species that they didn't know existed. And one was named, forgive my Latin, Diplodina Bartholomew, in honor of Elam Bartholomew's discovery of it. I mentioned he made a lot of Presbyterian, he did a lot of travel with the Presbyterian group, and in 1890, he made a trip to Washington, D.C. And the trip took 1 month. And just in case you're wondering, he traveled 3,200 miles by train and 100 miles by streetcar. And in 1895, he raised 140 bushel of wheat, which he was able to sell for 46 cents a bushel. It was grade 2. Test weight 61. He also raised 20 bushel of rye. But in 1895, he sold his corn crop for 15 cents a bushel. Now in 1894, he started planting cherry trees. And as time passed, his cherry orchard became legendary. And in 1897, he started raising alfalfa. Now, there aren't a lot of people at that time raising alfalfa out here. He'd already written several of these books on plant rusts and stuff. In 1898, the Kansas State Agricultural College conferred a Master's of Science degree on him. Now, his work with the Presbyterian Church a lot of it involved starting Sunday schools. And one time he went to a Bow Creek Sunday School convention and found them selling cigars as a fundraiser. That didn't go over too well. From 1903 to 1907, he was named a Presbyterian Sunday School missionary. Now, in case you're wondering, he traveled 37,810 miles in that job. He was paid $800 for those 4 years of work. He made 2,875 family visits, distributed 123,756 pages of literature, made 268 addresses, attended 243 schools, 68 conventions. He organized 43 schools with 1,820 teachers and students. The man kept records. And his diaries are that way for the entirety of his life. He was named an elder in the Presbyterian Church and was the first layman in Kansas to be a moderator at the presbytery. His oldest son died. He was going to Emporia College to be a minister, and he died of appendicitis. Now, one of his other sons had appendicitis earlier, and they had a fail-safe treatment, ice. But he got better. But his appendicitis was a real risk at that time. I mentioned that Elam loved trees. Well, by 1912, his farm in Rooks County, he had peach trees, apple trees, plum trees, cherry trees, lots and lots of cottonwood trees, and a few other trees that would grow in Kansas. Now, I did mention that I can't resist some of his writings. The way he wrote just spellbounds me. He visited Hayes, the Boot Hill in Hayes, and I quote, "Where are buried in unmarked graves a large number of tough thugs, gamblers, and cowboys who yielded up the ghost with boots on, at the close proximity to the muzzle of a loaded gun or revolver." End of quote. Now his daughter Beth left home and moved with her husband to Seattle, Washington. That's not a big deal now, but that was a pretty big deal then. It was a long ways away. One of the most important communities for him at the time was the town of Marvin. Now, railroads were coming this way. Elam raised cattle. He raised hogs. When he had livestock to sell, he couldn't haul it to town. You drove it. You herded it. He would herd his hogs to Marvin. Marvin had a stockyards. He would herd his cattle to Marvin. He did a lot of shopping in Marvin because they also had stores for supplies. But that was quite a community because the stockyards was quite an important part of this part of the country. Well, in 1910, Marvin changed its name. Does anybody know who it changed to? Glade. In 1910, Elam went to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City, Newark, Ohio, all on Sunday school business, but always, wherever he went, he took botany samples. And I also thought it was interesting that in that same year, one of his sons went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison for postgraduate work. Now, just some of the changes he saw in his life. In 1914, at the age of 62 years, he drove a car for the first time. That was quite an experience. So later that year, he went in Stockton and bought a Ford touring car for $585. He planned a trip with that fine automobile to the Rockies. So he made it as far as Alma, Nebraska before he broke down and he needed a mechanic. He went then to Bertrand, Nebraska, had 2 punctured tires en route. Eventually, he made the famous Lincoln Highway, which ran from Omaha to Cheyenne, Wyoming. There was one day on that road where he was able to travel 165 miles. He, most of the time when he was at a farm, wanted to come to Stockton, he walked. But he went 165 miles in one day. And on that trip, he traveled 1,300 miles. And coming home from Denver, he reported that they achieved a speed of 30 miles an hour. That was pretty exciting. And only 3 years later, he was in Niagara Falls, New York, and he saw for the first time an airplane flying. The world was changing. Now, Elam was doing a lot of work for the Kansas State Agricultural College and USDA. And in 1908, now you remember I mentioned that in 1897 he started raising alfalfa. In 1908, his was the largest alfalfa experiment station in the world. He had 142 varieties of alfalfa on his farm. Now the Kansas State Agricultural College, which became K-State, it was really some nice people, and they were pretty good to Elam. For instance, one year a couple professors came out and they wanted to go over things. You know, Elam was doing a lot of research work and they were doing research work, and they came out and spent a couple of days with him and then headed back to Manhattan. You know, accidentally, inadvertently, they left a microscope. Can you imagine? Elam couldn't afford a microscope, but studying fungus, how important a microscope was to his work. In 1890, Elam gave a talk at the Farmers Institute on germ theory. Now that was cutting edge science. He told about how a German scientist named Robert Koch had isolated and identified for the first time anthrax, and then had created an inoculant. And this was years before Louis Pasteur was doing his work. So in 1891, Elam was putting out lots of wheat plots, studying rust mostly. And he put out fungicides on that wheat as to examine how fungicides would affect the rust. That was in 1891. In 1892, he presented his first report, a 33-page report on wheat rust prevention. By 1893, he'd accumulated over 1,000 duplicate rust fungi specimens, which he was trading with professors in California and New York. And in 1894, he brought to the Rooks County Fair a display of 3,200 fungus specimens. I thought it was interesting also that same year, he dug 100 pounds of snake root and sold it for $25 to a Cincinnati, Ohio company. In 1899, he went fungi hunting in Colorado. That was the first time he ever saw Pike's Peak. And I quote, "The magnificence and supreme grandeur of the view from this summit, with an elevation of 14,000 feet and an area of 40,000 square miles spread out before you, is beyond the power of my pen to depict or my feeble language to describe." In 1892, he was appointed a special agent for USDA for wheat research and rust prevention. Now, farming was not easy. In 1901, it was hot and dry. He did raise 1,280 bushel of wheat, but everything else died. He didn't raise, well, except he had 77 bushel of sweet potatoes that he sold for $127. In 1903, he had a pretty good year. He raised 2,062 bushel of wheat, and he bought a binder for $133. Elam lived by two mottos: good enough is not good enough, and work hard, have faith, and get a hobby. He had spent hours and hours by candlelight studying botany and learning Latin, and now it was beginning to pay off in his life. The #1 mycology journal at the time was done by a professor named J.B. Ellis from New Jersey. It was the Ellis and Everhart's Fungi Columbianae. Forgive my Latin. And J.B. Ellis wanted to retire, and he needed somebody to take his place, and there weren't a lot of fungi specialists in the world. So he approached Elam Bartholomew about taking over that journal. Elam took it over, renamed it Fungi Columbani, took out the Ellis and Everhart, and he started sending with every subscriber, twice a year, 100 new specimens of fungus. So what that did, that made Elam have to spend even more time collecting fungi. And he became the largest and most well-known fungi collector in the country. He visited every state of the Union, Mexico and Canada. He said he collected fungi, he traveled to collect fungi over 133,185 miles by rail. Now in 1908, he made a trip to the Ozarks, and he collected 10,000 fungi samples in 20 days. He said he thinks he personally set a record, world record, by collecting 1,100 specimens in one day. The next year he traveled to Arizona, California, Oregon, and Washington collecting fungi. Now in 1905, Elam and his sons built a new 2-story house on his farm. It was a large, at the time, 2-story. The materials cost $2,100. He had a cabinet built in Stockton, cost him $30. He immediately filled that with 13,000 fungi specimens. And by 1911, he was specializing in rust and rust prevention. And in 1912, he built his laboratory. It's still standing out there. Now, he came to Stockton and borrowed a form and bought cement. He built all of his own concrete blocks using that form and put a tin roof on it because it was very important that it not be possible that it would burn down. And that building is still there, and it's in quite good shape. By 1913, he was for the first time able to contact Spencer Lens Company and buy his own microscope for $65. Now in 1910, he hired a couple of guys to build a barn. It was a big barn, a typical Kansas barn. He had to pay their labor. It cost him $155 in labor to build a barn. But finding good help wasn't an easy thing. He hired, in 1916, he hired a man and a wife to work for him, and I quote, "rottenest and most unsatisfactory help in 40 years. Both man and wife are petty sneak thieves, and socially and religiously are below the 0 mark." Now, cherry picking was a pretty big deal at Elam's farm. When cherry season would come around, the neighbors would all come, and they would often pick 17 to 25 bushel of cherries a day. Except in 1915, one day they picked 75 bushels of cherries at Elam's farm. Now, when you collect fungus specimens, it doesn't end there. You have to classify it, you have to store it, you have to preserve it. Most of that fell on Rachel. She had a way of taking a sheet of paper and folding it, making a fancy little envelope that she could put the specimens in, and then they would classify them, and it was a difficult job. But as time passed, his life was changing too, and in 1920, he had 430 acres of wheat that made 26 bushel per acre. And I just thought it was interesting. In 1924, he signed his first oil lease no drilling was ever done. In 1911, he published the book North American Uredinals. I'm sure we've all read that one. In 1919, the Kansas Academy of Science asked Elam to present his paper, Edible Mushrooms of Kansas. And he also visited Grafton, West Virginia. Now, I've never been there, and I don't plan to go. Let me tell you what he said about it. A smoke-begrimed town, being the dirtiest and most uninviting place I have ever visited. In all ways, it is a bigger freak than Barstow, California. I've never been to Barstow, California either. By 1926, he had the largest private herbarium in the entire country. He had 32,733 labeled fungi specimens, plus 70,250 duplicates labeled, and 15,070 specimens that he hadn't labeled yet. Well, in 1925, he decided that he was going to quit going on fungi collection trips. Not because he was 73 years old, but because, as he said, it no longer pays the expenses. In his life, he had attended 3 World's Fairs, Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco. In 1927, he published The Fungus Floral of Kansas and was awarded a Doctor of Science degree by the Kansas State Ag College. And in 1928, he published the book North American Plant Rust. Also in 1928, he republished the expanded second edition of North American Uredinals. Now, in case you're curious, a uredinal is a fungus it's a fungus that causes rust in a plant. You probably already knew that. In 1929, he sold his farm in Rooks County and moved to Hayes to become the curator of the Myological Museum. He'd already begun dispensing his herbarium. He'd sent 5,000 specimens to the Kansas Teachers College, 3,500 to Park College, 5,000 to the College of Emporia. He sold 6,400 labeled specimens to the Egyptian government in Cairo for $419. He sold 1,700 specimens to the Cawthorne Institute in New Zealand, 1,800 to KU, and after he died, they sold 30,000 specimens to Harvard University. He personally found over 360 specimens that were totally new to science. Now, many of you here knew and remember Marie Grover, his granddaughter. And Marie told me one time about how she had found a fungus that he didn't have, and how incredibly exciting that was for her to find a fungus that he didn't have, because he had them all. His last diary entry was September 21st, 1934. Elam passed on November 18th, 1934 at 82 years of age. I think there's one passage from his diary that tells as much as anything about what he thought about fungus. And I quote, "The world is so cluttered up with undigested food and waste material that if it were not for fungus and bacteria, it would be an impossible place to live. It is fungi and bacteria that are responsible for the decay of stubble, weeds, and everything else that we plow under." Now, I can't resist throwing in a few more tidbits from the diary. In 1920, they had an influenza pandemic. And all public gatherings were banned for 1 month. In 1922, he attended the funeral of M.J. Kubal, and in 1927, the Kubal Bank in Stockton folded. In 1922, he got his first set of false teeth. In 1929, he saw his first talking movie. And that same year, he went to the Hayes Airport and saw airplanes landing and taking off from Hayes, carrying passengers between Denver and Kansas City. And he had to work awfully hard to get a horse. In 1879, he wrote of an earthquake that they had. He wrote a lot about fires. Range fires were a big problem. Now in 1881, he wrote of a temperature that was negative 22 degrees on January 9th. And on July 19th, it was 106 degrees that same year. By 1882, fires weren't that big a problem anymore. There were very few mentions of fires, but they had dust storms. The plow had made it, and dust storms were a serious problem. In 1882, he wrote about Venus passing over the sun, which he knew happens once every 122 years. In 1894, he had a freeze on his wheat on May 19th. In 1895, he had a dust storm destroy 4,000 sweet potato plants. In 1904, Dr. Brand from the USDA came out to his farm and established an observatory for recording soil humidity and soil temperature. And in 1906, he lost every bit of his small grain and fruit to hail. In 1911 and 1913, Bow Creek went dry for 17 days. In June 8, 1918, he wrote of a total eclipse of the sun. His life encompassed so much change. Truly, Elam Bartholomew was a Rooks County legend, a legendary man of science, and a tremendous recorder of Rooks County history. Now, if you have any questions, I will attempt to answer it. I point out
that's what I was going to ask.
this book was written by Earl Bartholomew. Earl Muir.
And Shirley is here. Did you
Yes,
hear?
Shirley's here. And it records a lot of information from his diary. And this book, which they have at the museum, was written by one of his grandsons, David Bartholomew, and it goes through a lot more of the diary in detail, and also includes quite a few pictures and stuff. Are there any questions?
How about Earl? How was Earl related to him?
His son.
Pardon me?
Son.
Son?
Yeah.
Bartholomew, you mean?
Yeah.
Do you happen to recall what Rachel's maiden name was?
Well, I could look it up, but I don't recall. She was from Farmington, Illinois also. And one thing that may or may not be of interest, Farmington Township out here where they lived was not originally Farmington. It was a two-township township. You know, there was twice as big, and as people came in, they actually split it. And so Elam named it Farmington after Farmington, Illinois. So his township was in Farmington. It became Farmington Township, and the other one, whatever it was.
Whose place is the building on that's still standing?
Okay, it's owned by by Linda McLaughlin and Royce Muir, and that laboratory is real close to the road. If you know, just before Bow Creek, the first road that goes west, you'll go by there, it's, I don't know, a mile and a half, probably. There's a tin building, a metal building, and right next to it is this concrete block building. That was the laboratory.